Week 10 certainly started with a bang. Whether you're chasing 50 points from Jamar or rolling into week 10 with Joe Burrow's haul, you're going to need to make sure you nail those starts and sits so you can grab another win and set yourself up for the fantasy playoffs. We go through all the best starts and sits on the Fantasy First Down. I'm Ben Wasley. Welcome to the Fantasy First Down. Starting off with an apology. Apologize that our last video, our Streamers and Stashes video, came out 2 days late. Unfortunately, my internet's been down for 2 days, so I'm a little bit behind on everything. But now starts and sits are sorted. Rankings are out. You can check them out over at ffdfantasyfootball.com. You can also check out my articles over at football.rasball.com. Plus, if you've got any questions, leave them in the comments below, or you can always message me on Instagram at the Fantasy First Down or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no. Plus, it would be great if you could like and subscribe to this video. Really helps us out as well. But let's get into the starts and sits for Week 10. And as always, green means a top 9 matchup. Red means a bottom 9 matchup. These are my half PPR rankings with 4 points per passing touchdown. If you've got any questions about other scoring settings, just feel free to comment or message me. And Lamar Jackson, number 1, already paid off. Moving on, Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen, both very good options, but Brock Purdy way higher than you usually see him. The Bucs concede a lot of points. Now, admittedly, it's often because they're scoring a heap of points and end up in shootouts, but even when that's not the case, they are a team you can score against. I would expect that they use a lot of Christian McCaffrey and checkdowns rather than having him run straight into people early on. That will ultimately mean more points for Brock Purdy. So I feel like this could be a solid Brock Purdy game. He is someone that I like this week, although I must admit, I do regret not having Joe Burrow over him. I nearly did that and I changed it last minute because everyone else had him a lot lower. I don't like to be too far away from consensus. Jaden Daniels gets a tough matchup, but he's Jaden Daniels. He's got that rushing floor, so you still got to start him. Sam Darnold with a good matchup this week against Jacksonville. There really aren't that many better matchups in football for a quarterback. That is the second best one, behind, of course, Tampa Bay. And Jared Goff gets a fantastic matchup as well against Houston. Houston can see the 9th most points to quarterbacks, but the most important thing is that they can see the 4th fewest points to running backs. We know that the Lions tend to try to run the ball as much as possible. That's not going to be as possible in this case. I'm expecting a lot more check downs to their running backs and a lot stronger passing game. And that's going to really help Jared Goff. So Jared Goff is the start for me this week. It also is helped out by the fact there's not that many great options behind him. Matthew Stafford has a tough matchup traditionally against Miami, but with Cup back and also Puka Nacua no longer out for the game, I do think that Stafford's going to be better this week, but I don't feel great about him. I don't feel great about anyone outside that top 8. Baker Mayfield, okay matchup against San Fran, but even though it's likely to be a shootout, he's going to struggle to shoot with no good receiving weapons. Scott Kate Otten, he's got his receiving backs. Maybe Jalen McMillan plays, but they're banged up even behind the injured Mike Evans and the out for the season Chris Godwin. So it's an awkward situation for Baker. He's playing so well this season, but you can't trust him this week. He's still got good upside though. Kyler Murray gets a really tough matchup against the Jets. Patrick Mahomes also a tough matchup against Denver. Trust Kyler a little bit more because he's got that rushing floor. I do think there are some arguments to start Kyler over a Baker or a Stafford, for example, because of that rushing floor. You're less likely to have a total dud game, but I do like the upside of the other two just a little bit more. It is possible that game between the Cardinals and the Jets turns into a bit of a shootout because Aaron Rodgers has been a little bit better of late, especially with Devontae Adams arriving. That's why Rodgers is up at 13. That seems pretty high, but it is a good matchup against the Cardinals. The Cardinals have conceded the 12th most points against quarterbacks this season, but they've also had some easier matchups. So I do think that Rodgers will have a solid game. CJ Stroud, even though it's a good matchup against Detroit, he's just not playing very well at the moment. He doesn't have Stephon Diggs. He doesn't have Nico Collins. The run game is going well. Stroud's just not a high upside option at the moment, but against Detroit, when they're likely to be chasing that game, you have to feel like there's at least an opportunity for him to play well this week and kind of break back out again. Kirk Cousins is someone a lot of people like. I don't like him against New Orleans. he's not going to need to pass the ball. New Orleans have conceded the 9th fewest points against quarterbacks this season and the 8th most points against running backs. And now their team's a whole lot worse. There's no reason for Atlanta to pass the ball. They can just run the ball all game. It's going to be hard for the Saints to score against Atlanta. So I do think that Cousins is a lower end option this week, even though it looked like this would be a good matchup. Tua Tagovailoa, I need to see it consistently before I'm willing to put him in, even though the Rams matchup is okay. Daniel Jones gets a good matchup against Carolina, but he's Daniel Jones. At one point last week, he had 4 from 6 passing with a touchdown for 0 yards. He'd completed 4 passes, gotten a touchdown, and had passed for 0 yards. Weird. He'd also rushed for 50 yards at that point in time, so that does give him a floor, but you have to feel against Carolina, it's going to be a Tyrone Tracy game. You will see a little bit of neighbors, I think, but Jones is hard to trust. Justin Herbert, I know Bobby Lamarco, who I work with over at Rasball, is on their podcast on Friday night. You can check out the live show over on the Rasball YouTube channel. He talked a lot about Justin Herbert and feeling like this could be a good week for him. Not really feeling it against Tennessee. It is a tough matchup, but he has been looking better later, and it does give him a little bit better of a floor. Bo Nix I've really liked recently, but KC is a tough team to play against. You can't run on them at all, so you'd have to feel like there is a chance he's okay. Teams do pass on the Chiefs because they're often behind and chasing the game. They kind of have to. Is that what we're going to see from Nix? Well, it does give him a little bit of a floor, and that's why I've got him at least as a low-end startable option and solid super flex option. Everyone below there, it's getting pretty ugly. Mac Jones probably in for Trevor Lawrence, although that's not guaranteed yet. He is someone I'm not interested in starting unless you're absolutely desperate. Caleb Williams, again, I need to see more from him. Plenty of guys there with tough matchups I'm not interested in. Now, let's talk about running backs and a heap of fantastic running back matchups this week. These are mostly guys that would be good starts anyway. Now they get these matchups. Wow. Saquon Barkley, my number one guy this week against Dallas. Fantastic matchup. Got to be starting him. Got to be starting Bijan against the Saints because they're going to be able to run all day. The risk with Bijan is that when the Falcons are quite far ahead, and it's not even that far ahead, really just a score on a bit, is usually enough for them to put Bijan on the bench and use a whole heap of Tyler Algier to keep Bijan healthy. So you've got to hope that the Saints can at least stay with them for a little bit to keep Bijan in the game. I do think that you'll still make hay when the sun is shining, which will be much of the first half, I think, and a little bit into the second half. Alvin Kamara is really the only weapon for the Saints, and so you have to feel like he's a volume play. There's possibilities of him being solid there. Kyren Williams gets a great matchup against Miami. You can definitely run on them. Jonathan Taylor against Buffalo, you can run on them as well. I'm very high on Taylor relative to everyone else this week. Have we forgotten? He's very good at football, and they don't really want to pass the ball, so I think they're going to lean on him quite a lot. Breece Hall, again, ultra-talented, gets a great matchup against Arizona. You will see a little bit of Braylon Allen, but Breece Hall is still the guy. Devon Achan's had some very good weeks recently. They're checking down to him a lot, which helps as well. That really ups his upside. Christian McCaffrey, I feel like you have to start, but there's plenty of risk here. It's possible he's the running back one after this week. It is possible he just comes out and they immediately just play him normally and he's amazing. It's also possible that he's hardly used at all, that the game's in control for much of the game because Tampa can't score. And so you see a lot of Jordan Mason or Garendo or something like that. I don't know. I don't feel great about it, but the upside's so high that I have to have him in the top 10. Now, Tyrone Tracy, haven't had him in the top 10, and he's taking on Carolina, and that's just a fantastic matchup. He's the clear number one guy. Really like him this week. I feel like he's going to be very solid. He's got a good floor. The upside's clearly there. We've seen what he can do when they just give him the ball and allow him to run against bad run defenses. I feel like he's a fantastic option. I want to start him this week over the guys with riskier matchups. Aaron Jones gets a good matchup too against Jacksonville, but I don't know. He's only got like 3 touchdowns on the season. They're just not really using him in the red zone efficiently and effectively. And Cam Akers is getting more involved now. It's a situation I feel a bit awkward about, but he's still a solid start. Same thing with DeAndre Swift, not getting used in the red zone. They use kind of Roschon Johnson at the goal line, and that really hurts Swift's, I guess, touchdown upside. That means that even if he has a high volume game, gets over 100 yards, you're not that happy with his day. You kind of feel like he's left some points out there without getting those touchdowns and those opportunities he should be getting. Joe Mixon, really tough matchup against Detroit. He was top 3 option for me, I think, last week or the week before. This week gets that tough matchup. You could still kind of have to start him, but not ahead of other really solid players. James Conner starting to lose his hold on that job. They used Trey Benson very early in the game last week. Will we see that again in a game that should be close against the Jets? I don't know. That'll be very interesting to monitor. It'll be interesting to see if Benson gets more touches and when he gets the touches, because that's going to indicate what they're going to do moving forward. Are they just protecting Connor a little bit? Are they transferring it over to Benson? What's the plan here? They're very much in playoff contention. I think they might even be ahead in their division. So it can't be a case of thinking about next year. They're very much in contention to win this year. So I feel like they've got to keep using Connor. They may just be trying to keep him healthy. Jameer Gibbs, David Montgomery, tough matchup against Houston. It is not easy to run on Houston, and it is pretty feasible to pass on them. So I feel like Gibbs and Montgomery always have touchdown upside. Isn't Montgomery scored in like 11 straight games or something? But I don't know. It's just hard to trust the volume there. Gibbs was used less than Montgomery last week. I don't know if that's going to be the case this week. It's just really hard to rank Montgomery higher with how they're using those two. Gibbs just scores a lot more points in high efficiency situations or gets touches in high efficiency situations, and that makes him the better of the two backs. Plus, it's just always possible in any given week, they'll just transfer it all across to Gibbs and give him the load. Kareem Hunt against Denver. It's an okay matchup in what should be a pretty low-scoring game. Hunt's been getting touchdowns most weeks. Plenty of upside there. I'm fine with starting Kareem Hunt. J.K. Dobbins, same thing against Tennessee. It's an okay matchup, better running matchup than it is a passing matchup. But I don't know. I don't feel great about what they're doing there. They're not leaning on the running game like they were. They're kind of trusting in Herbert a little bit more. Will we see them go back to the run this week? That'll be interesting to see. Chase Brown, as we saw, did very well in that tough matchup by checking down to him. And that's something that can happen. If you are a receiving back, and we might see that with a Jameer Gibbs, for example, and we might even see that with a Joe Mixon. If you're out there for the receiving stats, you could well end up with really good volume from those check downs because they'll just give up on the run game immediately and use you in check downs, get you out in space. It worked really well with Brown. Of course, you got that touchdown too. It is entirely possible I'd do that with those other guys as well. James Cook had some very good weeks. Disappointing last week. I feel like this is just not the matchup for him. He's not really reliable from a week-to-week basis. Very fluky. So he's in at 20, but for me, he's not that far away from 13. They're all kind of close, those guys from 13 to 20. I really struggled ordering those guys. Chuba Hubbard even isn't someone I mind. Jonathan Brooks coming back is the reason I'm a little bit scared. I'm ranking this as if Brooks is going to play, but I don't think Brooks is going to be heavily involved. I think that should be indicated by the amount of money they've just given Chuba Hubbard. It's like $30 million over 4 years or something like that. It's not a huge amount of money, realistically. We're talking, $8 million a year, and the cap's going to keep going up over that time, and I don't know how much is guaranteed. I haven't looked into it yet. It doesn't really matter to me. It just signals the fact that they do value Hubbard and that Brooks isn't going to be the league winner some people suspected. I told you that earlier in the season. It was always going to be a waste of time holding on to Brooks in this offense, but I don't know. Hopefully you've got Hubbard, you've used him, you got a lot out of him, and now this offense is slowly going to transfer into an ugly committee, I think. For now, though, Hubbard is the starting option against the Giants. I don't think we see a lot of Brooks even if he plays. Tony Pollard gets that tough matchup against the Chargers, and Tyjae Spears is, I believe, back. I think he's even off the injury report. If anything, Pollard's more injured, I guess you could say, this week. So, I don't know. It doesn't mean great things for Pollard. He's been good when given the opportunity, but I don't think he's going to get the opportunity the way he was previously. They have kind of talked a little bit about trying to take a little bit of load off him. He's not exactly a young running back, and I feel like that means because he gets less load, he's someone you can't rely on as much. Najee Harris against Washington. This is an okay matchup, but with Warren back, you can't rely on Harris like you used to be able to. So I feel okay about this situation, but it's not exactly a great situation to go into. Ramondre Stevenson, 4 touchdowns in the last 2 weeks combined. Against Chicago, it's not a great matchup, but they have conceded the 12th most points to running backs. That wouldn't usually get you excited, but they've conceded the least points to quarterbacks and wide receivers. So clearly they're going to give touches to Stevenson because that is the best way to attack Chicago. Whether he's able to do anything with them is a question. He's been going at under 3 yards carry. He's been pretty terrible, but I don't know that it's him. I think it's more the O-line than anything else. We know how talented they at least think he is based on how much money they gave him. So is Stevenson someone you can rely on? No. Should you start him? Maybe, depending on your other options. Rico Dowdle gets a tough matchup against Philly, but is the clear number 1 guy. Austin Eckler, with Brian Robinson Jr. officially out against Pittsburgh. This is not a great matchup. Pittsburgh's got a good defense in general. You kind of can attack them out wide a little bit, but it's hard for quarterbacks against Pittsburgh. It is hard for running backs. 9th most points conceded against running backs, so it's not terrible, but they are a team that does like to shut down that middle of the field a little bit. They've got a really strong defense and a good D-line in particular. That's because they always draft for those D-line and O-line players in the first rounds. Now, Bucky Irving and Rashad White, really struggling to manage what order I put those two in. Irving is ahead for me, even though White gets a lot of the receiving work. But I feel like this is going to be a game where they do use a little bit of Irving. They'll use him on the goal line. White will get some receiving stuff, might get another receiving touchdown. But I feel like Irving's the safer of the two options. Raheem Mostert against the Rams, hopefully gets a touchdown. That's basically what you're thinking. In a non-PPR league, he's still pretty solid, but he's not getting that receiving work. It is Achane that's getting most of that work, and that means that Mostert is someone that is less reliable. Javonte Williams, horrible matchup against the Chiefs, cannot run on the Chiefs, and they're really struggling to run in Denver anyway. He's had one or two big games, but in easy matchups, this is not one of those, and Jaleel McLaughlin's getting annoyingly involved at times as well. Tank Bigsby, I mean, what do you make of this whole Jacksonville backfield? Bigsby seems to be getting more carries, but Etienne's just back from injury. Will he start to take over a little bit? Do we still see Dearness Johnson on the receiving downs? It's hard to know what to make of this. They take on Minnesota. It's a horrible matchup. I don't want to start any of these guys, but you do know that those checkdowns could happen. We talked about it happening with Chase Brown. It's possible it happens with Jacksonville. Probably goes to Etienne, but if it doesn't, he suddenly gets a lot less targets than Bigsby. Who do you really want to be starting in this situation? For me, neither of them. In PPR, maybe Etienne over Bigsby, but this is half PPR, so that's why I've got Bigsby higher. Jalen Warren, I just don't trust, but he is the best of the, I guess, handcuffs that you're starting. He's a bad handcuff because he's not going to get the load if there's an Najee Harris injury. He's still going to split with the Cordero Patterson. So for that reason, he's not someone that has a lot of value, but if you're desperate for a starter this week, he is an option. Tyler Algier, very high upside option because it is possible that they give him most of the carries late in the game if they blow out the Saints, and that means that he could be productive. So if you're looking for someone who might be available on waivers, firstly, should be picking him up and putting him on your bench anyway. He's one of the best stashes alongside Braylon Allen and Ray Davis, maybe. So certainly the Rams guy, I would be picking up Blake Corum as well. So I don't know. You've got options there, but for me, Algier is certainly the best of the guys that you can start of those handcuffs along with Warren. No one else there that really gets me excited. Jeremy McNichols would be interesting if it wasn't for that terrible matchup. And also, we don't really know what's happening with Rodriguez. I think that would probably just management now that the game was in hand. Roshan Johnson also has a little bit of upside because he's getting those goal line touches, but very little else. So you're kind of hoping for a touchdown or you're getting nothing out of him. And my favorite new handcuff is Cam Akers. He's obviously taken over from Ty Chandler, and they do seem to trust him more. He can be really explosive and a good option. So he's someone you can pick up if you need to. Wide receiver rankings, I mean, your boy said Jamar Chase. I was really high on Jamar Chase this week. Was telling anyone who was listening, Jamar Chase, DFS in everything. He's going to have a massive week against Baltimore. It's a fantastic matchup for wide receivers. It is every week. Totally not shocked he has a massive game. Very few people had him number one. Of the top 10 or 15, I think I'm sixth at the moment of the top 10 or 15 in accuracy. I think only 5 had Jamar Chase top, so hoping that moves me up the rankings back into the top 5 this week. But even out of the whole 200 in the Fantasy Pros rankings column, there are only about 30 or 40 that had Chase first. That really surprises me. It's such a good matchup. I do understand that Justin Jefferson has a good matchup against Jacksonville, but they're not going to need to pass the ball in the same way. Jacksonville with Mac Jones just has a lot less upside. Having said that, start both of them. This is really just for the sake of arguing over who's likely to be the number one. Tyreek Hill jumps up my rankings a lot against the Rams. This is a good matchup for him. They do tend to allow points to outside receivers. So I do think that Hill's going to be the guy here. Waddle is the one I'm a little bit concerned about. He's just not getting used properly, but I think we'll see plenty of Hill this game and plenty of Achane. In what should be a close game as well. I believe Vegas has it just 1 point apart or something like that. I think the Rams are slight favorites. Malik Neighbors gets Carolina. Always plenty of upside when you play against Carolina. It's not ideal for the wide receivers. 20th most points conceded against wide receivers. It does tend to be the tight ends and the running backs that score against them, but I still think Neighbors will get it done. Plenty of scoring upside here. Daniel Jones is going to have to go to him, I think. Amon-Ra Brown's been a little bit disappointing this season. Still been solid in PPR, but they've been able to run the ball so much that they haven't really needed to use him. Against Houston, can't run the ball that much. So I do think that we'll see plenty of Amon-Ra there. They certainly concede points to the slot as well. That really helps them as well. So I feel like this is a good St. Brown game. Kupp and Nakua, it's weird seeing them in red, but still having them up pretty high. It's hard to know also who's the main guy here. It is really hard to pass on Miami, but I can't not start those guys. They've both got massive upside. They can both have big boom games at any point in time, and you don't know when it's going to happen. So for me, they're just guys you have to have in your lineup because you'll regret it if they go for like 30 or 40 points. Garrett Wilson and Devontae Adams both in there as well. Both get solid matchups against Arizona. It's another situation where you don't know which one will go off. They might have good games. They both had at least 10 targets last week, I believe, and they both had solid games. So it is possible they're both good. This is one of those games that could be relatively high scoring. We don't know exactly what's going to happen there. It could a little bit go either way. I think Vegas has it as like 46.5 points. It's the line with the Jets slight favorites. Compare that to like the Bucks and 49ers, which is at 50 points. But then also compare it to like the Chargers and Titans, which is at 39 points. So it's on the higher side. If I look at the other games, I believe it's like 4th or 5th on the week as high point scoring games, but I feel like it could end up being very high scoring or could be low scoring, which is why they've kind of gone in the middle. Of course, the high scoring one was the Bengals game, which is down as 53 points. Unsurprising, and they still beat the over. Deebo Samuel, a little bit risky injury issues at the moment, but he's always got injury issues. He's still a top guy. Gets a really good matchup against Tampa. They're going to have to use him. Having said that, McCaffrey back, Kittle in there. Can they just lean on Jennings instead if Debo's struggling? I don't think they will, but I think it is possible. AJ Brown, tougher matchup against Dallas. You do tend to just run on Dallas, which is why Saquon was number one, of course. But it is possible there's just so many points in this game that you still see Brown involved. It's not like Dallas has an amazing pass defense. It does help that they've probably got Micah Parsons back. They've got Diggs back, it seems. But I don't know. Teams don't tend to pass on them. They do tend to go to the running backs. But you can. They're still top half in conceding points against wide receivers. That's why Brown's a solid option, even though I feel like Dallas is going to struggle to move the ball with Cooper Kupp. And basically, I think the Eagles are going to be able to do whatever they want. If they want to score, they can probably go score. If they don't want to, maybe they just kind of grind out the game. Tank Dell gets that fantastic matchup against Detroit. I've got him higher than most, assuming that Nico Collins is out. If Nico Collins plays, then Tank Dell moves down a lot. It's a great matchup against Detroit. You know that they're going to need to chase the game. They're going to have to go via Dell. I wanted to put him higher last week, but it was just such a tough matchup, and I hadn't seen it. I've seen it now. Happy to put him higher. Drake London, assuming he's healthy, gets a good matchup against New Orleans. I do think they probably can run the ball on New Orleans, but you can also pass on them. And for that reason, I feel like Drake London's going to have a solid game. And if you don't like him, Darnell Mooney is fine as well. I hope both of them as green. It's technically New Orleans is 11th. That's an error, but it's still a solid matchup. They're still both viable options, but it's also possible it's just a running back game. If London's out, all of a sudden Mooney will jump to about 19. I think it's not going to make a massive difference to me, but he is still a very solid option this week. Brian Thomas, I like this week. Minnesota's a great matchup. Again, that's meant to be green. There's a couple of errors just in this area here of the alphabet for the wide receivers. Brian Thomas gets a great matchup, has that chest injury, wasn't used a lot last week with Mac Jones. Will Mac Jones still use him? I think probably yes. That does make him risky, but still plenty of upside. So that's why I've got him in there. Might move CeeDee Lamb up a couple of spots because he's CeeDee Lamb, but how much can you trust Cooper Rush to use him? I don't. I feel like they'll still scheme up ways to get him the ball, but he's no longer one of those top 10 options. I feel like the highest I'll move him is maybe 13 or 14. George Pickens, tough matchup against Washington, especially for an out wide receiver. But he's George Pickens. He's the number one guy in their offense. They're no longer limiting his routes. He is a very good start. I'd be starting him every week, essentially. Terry McLaurin, again, had a weird week last week where he didn't get many yards, but got touchdowns. Fantastic in non-PPR. Not ideal in PPR or half PPR, but anytime you get 2 touchdowns, you're not complaining. Gets an okay matchup against Pittsburgh, but certainly a bottom half matchup and not an ideal one for me. Devonta Smith against Dallas, solid matchup. Last couple of weeks has been very good. This is his first trickier matchup, but he's still a very solid option. Same with AJ Brown. He's going to have an okay game. He'll get some targets, but doesn't have the upside of some of the guys around him. Josh Downs against Buffalo is a tougher matchup. He is at least in the slot, and that really helps against Buffalo. So even though it's a red matchup based on points conceded, according to the Razzball slot versus wide analysis tool, which I use for a lot of my wide receiver rankings, Buffalo certainly has conceded more points to the slot recently. So that's something you can definitely target. DeAndre Hopkins had a really good game last week, but against Denver, I'm not trusting him. I think you'll probably see some pretty good cover defense, and for that reason, he's not someone I'm going out of my way to start, but there's not many good options around him. For that reason, he still ends up at 22. Khalil Shakir, same situation. Don't want to go out of my way to use him, but the Colts do tend to be a little bit of a slot funnel defense. And for that reason, he should be the guy that they look to. Certainly has some solid upside, but not as much touchdown upside as some of the other guys. Same thing with Vlad McConkey. I feel like because he's one of those smaller receivers, he'll get a lot of volume. In PPR, he and Shakir would be a lot higher, so would Downs. But in half PPR, that lack of touchdown upside really limits them a little bit. Calvin Ridley against the Chargers. Can't trust him, especially with Will Levis back, but he's still an okay option. He's kind of like a very high-end wide receiver 3. Same thing with Martin Harrison Jr. Tough matchup. Really hard to trust at the moment. Had one boom game in the last 6 weeks and 5 bust games. In fact, he scored more points in that one boom game than in the other 5 games combined, or roughly. So, look, he's got to get better matchups. This is his 7th tough matchup in a row. It's absolutely insane for the rookie. It's no wonder he's having a tough season. Just let him play against some easier defenses. It's easy for Malik Neighbors when he's playing against Carolina. It's a lot tougher for Harrison when he's playing against these top defenses. DJ Moore, I keep waiting for him to have a better game again. He's been one of the busts of the season, realistically. I've been so disappointed in him. Against New England, it's an okay matchup. You can run on them, so they don't need to use more. It might just be a whole heap of Swift, but you'd have to feel like they've got to get him going at some point in time. This would be a good game to do it. So DJ Moore, start him if you need to. I don't really want to. Same thing with Jalen Waddle. It's hard to feel good about him. The floor's really low for those guys. Cortland Sutton, fantastic the last 2 weeks. Week 7, he scored no points. Then he comes out and puts down centuries in the last 2 weeks. Can you trust him this week? No. Last 2 weeks were because he had fantastic matchups. Okay, I called that in this show and in my Streamers and Stashes show and in the Slot versus Wide article I do as well. It was always going to be 2 good weeks for Cortland Sutton. This is not one of those weeks. You cannot trust your outside receivers against the Chiefs. They're a bottom 10 matchup. Having said that, he's still an okay option. He's just not someone you have to kind of force into your lineups. He's more of like a desperation wide receiver 3 range guy. In a shallower league, you're probably not starting him. In standard leagues, you probably kind of have to. Jordan Addison gets a really good matchup against Jacksonville. Are they going to need to pass the ball enough? Well, no, probably not. I think Jacksonville is going to really struggle with Mac Jones there, but I think they're probably still going to score enough points early on to get that league that Jordan Addison could easily be involved. He's got a very low floor. So do most of these guys here. Amari Cooper, who knows what's happening with his health and his usage. Juwan Jennings, first game back, competing against some big names like CMC, Kittle, and Debo. For that reason, he can't be trusted in a game that you should see the Bucs conceding a lot of points, but I don't know, they're not probably going to score a lot of points. So I don't know that it's going to be as much a shootout as we hope. Adunze and Allen, I talked about Bear's situation. It's ugly. Jamison Williams, first week back from that suspension. Do they punish him by not using him or get him back involved? It is a good matchup against Houston. I kind of want to move him higher, maybe ahead of Adunze, but I don't trust it. Wan'Dale Robinson with probably Darius Slayton out. That's why he's up this high against Carolina. You feel like maybe they might go to him a little bit more with no Slayton. Xavier Leggett, been excellent in the red zone the last few games. That's where the upside is here against the Giants, but you're really hoping for those red zone targets. Bryce Young kind of hurts him a little bit relative to Andy Dalton, but he's still going okay. Certainly getting those targets, but I don't know. I don't trust him, especially not if Adam Thielen's back, which is still a question mark, though unlikely. Quentin Johnston had that massive game last week. I'm not starting him this week. This is a really tough matchup against Tennessee. That was a little bit of a fluky situation anyway. Now he takes on the team that's conceded the 4th fewest points against wide receivers. Even Joshua Palmer had a good game last week. So, yes, Johnston looks good, but it was a little bit fluky. He's always going to have those boom games. I absolutely do not trust him. I'm not putting him in my lineup this week unless I have to, but he's a fantastic bench stash. Same thing with Joshua Palmer. You guys know I love Johnston, but I just can't start him this week. Xavier Worthy dropping down with Hopkins involved. Still got Kelsey there. Still got Hunt involved. Worthy's just, you need a touchdown from him, basically. He's not going to get high volume. He's not that sort of player. He's explosive. He'll make some big plays, but he's not going to get a lot of volume. Noah Brown, one of those interesting guys that you can stream this week because he's available in most leagues. In most leagues, when people are asking me, who do I start in this situation, they're talking about some real ugly names. I usually say is Noah Brown available because to me, of the guy in those leagues, he's the guy that most people aren't thinking about. Gets an okay matchup against Pittsburgh. It's possible they'll cover McLaurin well, and it will be Brown that gets a lot of targets. None of these other guys really excite me. Don't really want to start the Pats guys. Ricky Pearsall's way too risky with Jennings and Debo involved and Kittle there and CMC there. He's like the number 5. Of course, it could be like that Baltimore game where there's a whole heap of options there and they end up going to the Nelson Aguilars and the Tylan Wallaces. Could happen with Pearsall, but I think probably not. That's why Demarcus Robinson's up there. He's getting a whole heap of touchdowns at the moment, even though he's not getting targets. Gabe Davis is an interesting low-end guy. Same with Parker Washington. Jacksonville's going to have to throw the ball on Minnesota because you can. It's not easy to run on them, and they're likely to be behind. So for that reason, I think that Gabe Davis and Parker Washington could get those targets. Washington's an interesting PPR option, assuming they keep him in the slot. Finally, Ray McLeod. Don't feel great about that. There's just very few options in this range. Finally, tight ends. George Kittle, I'm putting him back on top because he has a good matchup. Travis Kelce doesn't, but they're both likely to be good. And frankly, so is Cade Otton. I was very high on Cade Otton last week, and he paid off. I think he's going to have another good game this week. Those top three are pretty much interchangeable. If you got two of them, which is possible because of how well Otton is playing, I like Otton a little bit better in PPR, but I like the other two in half PPR. Trey McBride gets a tough matchup against the Jets, but I still think he'll get the volume. Will he get touchdowns? We'll have to see. That's kind of what you need as a tight end, but that volume is going to really help. Same thing with Evan Ingram. He's more of a volume guy, very rarely scores touchdowns. So for that reason, in a PPR league, I do like McBride. I like Ingram as well. In a non-PPR or half PPR, Taysom Hill, he's likely to get a touchdown with how they play with him. Of course, Saints going to have to score a touchdown for that to happen. Going to have to get to the red zone. So, all right. I trust Derek Carr to get there with Alvin Kamara and the other options they have. I don't trust any of their wide receivers to be fantasy options. I think that Kamara and Hill are going to score a lot of the points and that Carr will be involved a little bit as well. Mike Gesicki, unfortunately, didn't pan out because Tanner Hudson had a big game. That should have been Gesicki's points. I'm very annoyed about that. I don't know what they're doing. Use Gesicki. He's a significantly more talented player than Hudson. Hudson kind of made it work, but you had Gesicki there as an option. You didn't use him. Didn't love it. Dalton Kincaid for the Bills against the Colts with Amari Cooper back. Not a great option. If Cooper's out, then all of a sudden Kincaid might move up to number 5 because suddenly he becomes to one of their top options with Shakir, keeping in mind that Keon Coleman is out and possibly even going to IR, though I hope not. Mark Andrews, of course, had a good game. Wish I had him higher, but just didn't make sense in a game they were expected to lead. Andrews doesn't get involved in games where they're expected to win. That is most games, admittedly, for them, but this is always going to be close enough that I was willing to put him in the top 10, but ended up having one of those big games because they were behind, and it's just the way it goes. And TJ Hawkinson, I don't trust his volume, but there's very few other good options. You got Brock Bowers and David Njoku one by. That means you end up with more guys sliding up. At some stage, Hawkinson's going to be a good option this year, I think, but he is very hard to trust at the moment with lower route count, and also still having Justin Jefferson out there getting a lot of targets. No one else I particularly love. Kyle Pitts, really hard to trust when they're winning. They use him more when they're losing. Sam Laporta's kind of had a couple of good weeks, but it's hard to be a tight end against Houston, and I don't know. I don't trust him. You can use him if you need to, but I don't trust him. Jake Ferguson in this situation with Cooper Rush, very hard to trust. Touchdown upside is very low, but he might get a few targets on PPR. He is a little bit higher. Hunter Henry's had some good weeks, but this doesn't really feel like a week for him, but he might be okay. You just never know with Henry. He has those big weeks and those quiet weeks, and you just got to hope. Jonnu Smith gets a good matchup against the Rams, but they've got a lot of other weapons. He's not the guy I think they'll go to, but if they do a good job of shutting the other guys down, we've seen Smith have some big weeks. No one else there really excites me. Theo Johnson's kind of emerging a little bit. Been getting a lot of snaps all season and routes, but hasn't been getting the targets. Taking on Carolina, the touchdown upside is high. He is someone that could emerge. It's more of a dynasty stash for me. Dallas Goedert's been disappointing. I don't think they're going to need him. If there's one injury to one of their wide receivers or Saquon, all of a sudden he's going to be great. First week back, I just don't trust him. Also interesting to see what's happening in Carolina. Jatavian Sanders had big weeks whenever Tommy Tremble's out. Tremble is supposedly back this week, but surely now they give it over to Sanders. He had like 87 yards and going 4 for 5 last week was really good. I feel like they need to get him started, but I don't know. Whenever Tremble's there, it's Tremble, and Tremble's pretty average. So it's a weird situation. But yeah, tight end landscape behind those top guys, a little bit ugly, but you can get by with like numbers 11 to 14 maybe. And that's all we've got for the starts and sits show for week 10. I wish you a heap of luck in your game this weekend, and I hope you enjoy the football as well. I'll be back next week, as always, with my waiver wire show on Tuesday, my streamers and stashes show on Thursday morning, and of course, the start sit show will be back again next week as well. You can also check out my articles over at football.rasball.com. If If you need rankings help, ffdfantasyfootball.com. You got questions in the comments or at the Fantasy First Down on Instagram or on Twitter at Fantasy First Down with no O. And finally, would be fantastic if you could like and subscribe on YouTube. Look forward to talking to you guys next week.